On today's episode of Cornell Keynotes, we are going to explore the power of truth-telling in building high-performing teams with Robert Newman, who is Senior Lecturer and Executive Director of Cornell's Engineering Management Program. Now, drawing from his experience as a former CEO and now current faculty author of Cornell's project leadership programs, Robert reveals why honest communication is not just an ethical choice. It's a strategic necessity. So you're going to learn practical techniques for creating psychological safety among your team. You're going to learn how to implement what's called radical candor. This is a terrific segment. And ultimately overcoming the fear of difficult conversations. So Robert's going to share actionable strategies for delivering constructive feedback and, maybe more importantly, creating an environment where team members feel empowered to speak honestly, all the while directly connecting these practices to improve team performance and organizational success. So I want you to be sure to check out the episode notes for information about Cornell's project leadership and Project Management 360 certificate programs. Now, here's my conversation with Robert Newman. So Robert, I'm pleased to have you back on the show after several years. I want you to set us up a little bit. Tell us what you're up to. Tell us about your industry experience, your history at Cornell and beyond, and how your experience and expertise directly informs what we're going to be talking about today.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Well, I wasn't always a teacher at Cornell. I came from industry, typically business to business, customers facing technology industries in manufacturing, really 7 or so different industries and with global customers around the world. So I'm new to teaching somewhat, but teaching and coaching was always my preferred management style. So I love teaching, and that's how I ended up here. I've now been at Cornell for 8 years, teaching within their engineering department, and I primarily teach the people skill needed to build and maintain high performance teams, how to motivate people, how to communicate better, how to have better and more productive conflict management, and how to have those difficult conversations.
Thanks for the setup there. I want to ask you, Robert, so how and why are we talking about truth-telling in a team context, and why is it so critical for building high-performance teams?
First of all, it's good to have a definition clarified. Like truth telling, when I'm talking about it in this context, it's about speaking the truth even when it feels uncomfortable or risky to us. And when we think about speaking the truth, we often think in absolutes, like telling the truth versus being deceptive, or, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And there's an element of that. But most of the time when we're talking about truth telling, we're talking about something else. I'm not talking about be honest instead of being deceptive. I'm talking about be honest and open enough to tell me actually the things you're feeling, the things you believe, the things you're concerned about, the things that worry you, the areas where your values and my values may be butting heads. So in this arena, as we're trying to build great teams and keep them communicating well, truth telling is really about open, honest communication about things that we might instinctively keep quiet about. And when we truth tell, we end up with teams that have deeper trust, greater understanding, clearer communication, less baggage and resentment. And it turns to be a great motivator and a great performance driver. Whereas if we default to being a little bit reserved in our truth telling, people stay silent, people avoid conflict. Issues remain unresolved and undiscussed. And then we end up with, we're not aligned well, and our motivation on our team drops. So in my view, truth telling in this context isn't one of those soft skills that you think is, oh, that's just nice to have it. It's one of those critical skills. If we're going to be pragmatic and say, I want to build a great team that functions really well and survives, we need to understand that truth telling is some of the skills that are needed to make sure the team has a chance at that.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to dig in a little bit further. I want to know, why is truth telling important? I mean, we've sort of established that there's the obvious moral and ethical value in telling the truth, but let's get cold and down to business. What is the material benefit of telling the truth in this context?
We probably could spend a day listing all the good things that happen when we practice truth telling in the right context. And that means not only are we practicing truth telling, but we're doing it respectfully. We're doing it humbly. We're doing it with some tact and skill. So there's a huge number of goals that we can establish. If we want to have teams that are more proactively communicating, trusting each other, if we want to be seen as credible as a leader who's not afraid to make sure things are going in the right direction, if we want to have a team who's continually improving in their performance and their ability to handle tasks and stress and complex situations that occur, truth telling is critical for that. And this kind of leads me to like one of the key things we need to understand though as we practice truth telling. Although there's this myriad of good things we're going to get out of it, when we practice truth telling, we it's very dangerous if we go into truth telling with the idea of I'm going to practice truth telling to get my way or to maybe ensure that you and me agree on something. Because if you have those as goals, those are kind of misguided and actually quite hazardous. So the goal of me practicing truth telling with you is not to fix what I see is wrong with you. It's actually to build understanding, to build empathy so that you might understand my view and I might understand your view better, and to make sure that we're in a place where the future relationship can be stronger as opposed to weaker or going forward with some resentment or confusion.
So, can you give a common example, possibly like a business scenario of truth telling that our listeners or our viewers might relate to directly?
Yes, I can. So I think the easiest one that probably hopefully everyone on this podcast can relate to is thinking about how good we are or how much difficult we have with saying no. And so it turns out that when we say no, that we have a lot of pressure. And when our boss comes and asks us for something, or a colleague asks us for something, and a customer asks for something, there's this huge pressure to say yes, no matter where that might fit in our priorities for the day, no matter how much that might interrupt our schedule. One of the most basic things we can do to improve our truth telling ability is get a little bit better at saying no when we mean no. And like say a no that doesn't have the possibility of a yes. So there's times that we need to protect ourselves, to set boundaries. And if we don't, if we're bad at saying no, and this is, to be honest, one of the things I really struggle with still, I'm a little bit of a people pleaser and I want to see everybody succeed, which means I might accept you kind of taking the monkey off your back and putting it on my back when I don't want it there or when I don't have the bandwidth for it. So if I'm not good at saying no in those occasions, I get overextended. I increase my stress. I decrease my ability to do things that are actually more important on my schedule. And I build up resentment between me and you. So all those times when we give in and say yes to people when we really want to say no, we're actually hurting ourselves and we're being a little bit unfair to that person too, because we're not communicating honestly and clearly to them. And whereas if we said like, I really can't, and here's why, that's much more honest and that's going to build a much stronger relationship between us. I need to not be so worried that you might be mad at me and be more worried that I'm telling you the truth.
And there's the other part too, which is you got to keep it real with yourself and ensure that you don't overextend yourself and ultimately deliver, something like suboptimal results, right? Does that figure into it?
Oh, it absolutely does. And that's a trap I think everyone falls into from time to time. I certainly do. I don't like telling people no. I want everything to work out. I want to be seen as somebody who's helping and cares about other people. And I need to do that while also still setting some boundaries and protecting myself and being honest about how what you're asking for might be an effect on me.
You had just mentioned that you tend to say yes, Any other further elaboration on that or any advice, frankly?
Yeah, so I do. And so I think one of the things is as we practice truth telling and as we gain a little self-awareness is don't be hard on yourself. If you caught yourself not saying no when you wanted to, don't beat yourself up. Just try to at least once in a while say like sometime this week, I'm going to say no when I mean no, even though I feel pressured to say like take small steps and reward yourself for them. And then think of the other ways, some other ways that we can practice truth telling. So that other than saying no, there's simple things like saying what you like, saying what you want, saying what you need. There's aspects of saying what you don't like, say what you don't want, saying what you need to have less of in your life or in your work, sharing what you feel or what you believe. These are all ways that we can open up conversations and share things that are important to us that we might hesitate to, that we might hold back and not share. And it actually is critically important that we share with other people. Really, what do I like? What do I dislike? What do I want to see more of? And one of the things that holds us back can be, well, I don't want to be seen as nitpicky, or I don't want to point out, and that's a good motivation to have. I mean, certainly, I don't want you to tell me everything you don't like about me. Please don't. But you could tell me some of the things, the ones that are important, right? Don't hesitate to tell me the ones that are going to bother you as you walk away. So there's this concept that we kind of like have this, even as children, we're taught, hey, if you can't say something nice, don't say nothing at all, right? Well, Sometimes it's important that you say things. And it's not necessarily being gracious by not telling me, hey, in the meeting yesterday when you said this, it really upset me, and here's why. Right? That's not being gracious. That's actually being a little bit of a coward. You're a little bit of afraid to bring that up. And we need to recognize that and understand that the more we let those things build up, this is what we call not keeping short accounts. If you have a relationship where now you can look back and now there's 5 or 6 things that Robert has done in the last 2 months that bothered you, right? If you had kept sort of counts, you would have been able to clear the air. You would have been able to get rid of misunderstandings, right? We would have been able to build empathy. I'd understand how things were affecting you more. You might understand things differently from my side of my view. And so this is a really critical skill to get over that mindset that, oh, I don't think I want to bring this up. It's like, if you're still thinking about it, you need to bring it up.
We've laid the landscape here, but you're starting to offer some recommendations and techniques for truth telling that our listeners can take away. And I think this is perhaps the most critical. This is the heart of the conversation. But tell me a little bit about some of the techniques you'd like to either employ or recommend to others.
Sure. There's a number of techniques that are common. There's some I love, there's some I don't love. And then some, they all have pros and cons, right? And a lot of them are focused on how do they make it easier or simpler for the speaker to deal with the fact that this is an uncomfortable conversation to bring up. I like to focus more on what are our goals. So as we bring up uncomfortable conversations and as we practice truth tell, I like to think like we have a matrix of goals. If you're a manager, it's not just I want to deal with this one situation. I also want this relationship to get better and stronger. I also want future communication to be more proactive. I also want this person to grow and develop. I want the team to prosper, and I want the customer to be happy. There's a matrix of things. I'm not just dealing with the one issue at hand. And so when we keep that in mind, that helps us drive these conversations in the right way. One of the most common ways that people learn to do this is the SBI technique, which is situation, behavior, impact. And there's a lot of things about that I like. It's good in that it teaches us to be very specific, not general. The specific behavior I want to talk about, Chris, when you came 20 minutes late to the meeting yesterday, this is the impact it had. We had a number of people that were sitting around, they were actually getting pretty upset. So it's good for us to be direct. It's great for that. What I feel it's lacking in is it doesn't leave you with what do I want, right? I can tell you what I didn't like, but you need to move towards like this is what I want. And so one of my favorite techniques is actually by the author Anthony Mercino. It's the getting clear technique. And it again is specific. It says like when you showed up 20 minutes late for the meeting, then I felt upset, frustrated, angry, whatever it was, whatever my feeling was, I share that because we had 10 people sitting around with nothing to do that were getting pretty upset that they were wasting time. What I'd like to do is if you're going to be late again, I would like it if you just call my cell phone so that we know you're going to be late. And so I give you something easy that you can say yes to. Now, a couple caveats about this. I would never jump into a getting clear technique before I followed Stephen Covey's advice of seek first to understand, then to be understood. So right before I start saying, hey, when you showed up late for the meeting, I was really angry. I might first be wise to say, hey, Chris, what happened so that you didn't make the meeting on time, right? And you say, oh, well, there was an auto accident on the way to work and I had to stop and give somebody CPR. Okay, what I felt about you not phone calling me is completely meaningless now, right? So I'm not going to dive into, oh, you should have given me a phone call. Like you obviously were doing something more important. So it's important to understand what somebody was going through. And then when it's appropriate, use a technique like this. Now, this technique has some big advantages. One of it's hyper specific. I'm not going to come to you and say, when you're always late for meetings. I'm going to say, when you were late for the meeting yesterday. It's one specific thing. So I'm not categorizing, I'm not attacking you as a person. And then the one thing I like about this a lot is it includes this emotional statement. Then I felt sad. Then I felt scared, whatever it was. Because what happens is when I approach a difficult conversation and I include how it made me feel, it tends to be fairly disarming to the other person. If you're in a mode where you might be ready to get defensive or reactive to this conversation, and I'm just talking about how I felt, it is really good for building empathy. It's much more likely you're going to empathize with me and how I felt, and you're not going to feel attacked. And that's critically important because if I want to truth tell, but I want to truth tell in a way that's most likely going to lead to healthy conflict, not unhealthy conflict. And I need to have it in a way that you do not feel attacked. And then I'm going to move on to making sure you know something I want. And I'm going to try to make that something easy for you to say yes to. You've probably heard the phrase, give people something to say yes to. I want to give you something that you can very easily, oh yeah, I'll try to call you if I was ever late again.
I like what you've done there. And you started to hint at the empathy component, which is what we're going to touch on here in just a moment. But I also like the idea that it directs it back to you, right? I felt this way. And what does this do in your experience for the other person? I'm not going to say it may make them a little more open, maybe disarming to some degree, but ultimately, where does it get you?
So again, remember going back earlier, where he's talked about my goal is not that you agree with me. My goal is not that I'm going to get my way. My goal is there's a situation where there's conflict, there's a state of discord in the relationship. I want to get clarity. I want to get understanding. Maybe it's not you need to understand me. Maybe I need to understand you. Right. And so I'm going to open up this subject in a way that it's giving you also opportunity to correct. Like you may say, well, I'm sorry you felt that way, but here's what actually happened. Or here's what it looks like from my view. I'm trying to open up a conversation that could be difficult or that could go to an unhealthy conflict easily. And I'm trying to pave the way for this to be a healthy conflict, a healthy discussion where maybe both of us learn and both of us are more comfortable the next time we have to have a discussion like this.
Yeah, this is very useful. So, just to kind of recap the last few minutes, we've provided a few tools or frameworks for thinking for our audience. The concept of keeping short accounts, the situation, behavior, impact technique, the getting clear technique. These are all things that are readily Googleable, right? I mean,
Yes.
these are open in the world. There's a wealth of information about these. So for those of us that want to incorporate this and pull this into the way we do work, I recommend you start with those things. So I just thought I'd call some of those out. Okay, so to the ends that you've just described, I mean, how should leaders create, and this is my favorite part, a safe space for people to actually express themselves honestly without fear of retaliation, ultimately, so we're having productive dialogue? How do we get there?
I think that's a great question. And it really leans us towards how do we create a psychologically safe workplace? And one thing I would kind of make clear before we dive too much into that is we need to understand and even communicate to our teams the difference between a safe environment or an unsafe environment and an uncomfortable environment. I don't mind if you're uncomfortable. I don't mind if I'm uncomfortable. That doesn't mean it's not safe, right? So we need to get to a point where we feel safe having uncomfortable conversations, right? There's an old saying, and I think it's from Socrates, that say, the difficult things aren't difficult. They're only difficult because we don't do them, right? It's not that we don't do them because they're difficult. They're difficult because we don't do them, right? And so the more we practice these things, the more it gets comfortable. When we talk about a safe environment, we're really talking about an environment where people are free to share their mistakes, their uncertainty, their concerns, their fears, where people are free to share their creative out of the box ideas, where people see that, hey, when I give feedback, it's actually heard, it's actually listened to. I may or may not get my way, but it's being received, I'm being recognized, I'm being respected. Me and my opinions belong here and are valued here. And that we kind of normalize, hey, by the way, part of being an organization full of human beings is that we will have failures and we learn from the failures.
I'm going to take a little dialectical off ramp here. I want to run something by you. So I just want to say that the word safe space has had some negative connotations, certainly over the last few years. The idea is I want to be guaranteed a place where it's free of conflict, or I'm never challenged. And I just want to say out loud that that's not what we're talking about here. We're not insulating ourselves from having to solve problems, right?
We're not insulating ourselves from having to solve problems. And we're not insulating ourselves from feeling extremely uncomfortable, or maybe even having people point out things that need to be improved in us. That's not what safety is all about, right? Safety is understanding that, you know, if I ask for help, I'm likely to get help. If I told you I made a mistake, I'm likely to get help so I don't make the mistake in the future. If I have an idea that you don't like, we can have an honest, open discussion about it. A lot of times people confuse being safe and being comfortable, right? And we're not always going to be comfortable. If we want teams that have a very high performance, we have teams who are very, very good with working outside their comfort zone. And I think you can relate to that. So I think that, there's a big difference between that misunderstanding of a safe place and being a pragmatic, honest, open, direct professional.
Yeah. Thank you for the clarity. So, Robert Newman, I want to ask you, in your experience, what would be, if you had to identify one, the single biggest barrier preventing teams from embracing honest communication? And what should a team leader do? What do you offer for that?
Okay, that's great. I think I don't think I can keep it to one, but the biggest barrier is our brains, the way our brains work. The fear of criticism is an incredibly powerful subconscious emotion that drives, or in this case, usually inhibits our behavior greatly. There's something called pre-thinking where we subconsciously imagine the worst possible things that can happen. And sometimes we do it consciously, where we actually say, oh, if I speak up, I might get laughed at. I might get told that my opinions don't count. Or if I speak up on this, I might get fired, right? That's our brains run away with these worst possible negative outcomes. And we're really good at snowballing down that path. And a lot of times it happens subconsciously. We don't realize our brain is doing it, but it inhibits our behavior. And then sometimes we're actually working ourselves through, and sometimes we'll actually verbalize it. So I've had students or alumni come to me for coaching. I've got this difficult situation at work, and we talk about how to truth tell into it. It's like, well, I think if I do that, I might get fired. And it's like, you know what? That's pre-thinking. That's a cognitive distortion, also called catastrophizing. It's perfectly human. It's the way our brains work, but it's not beneficial. It's not necessarily helpful. And the truth is, in most cases, if you got fired for bringing this up, it might be illegal. If you got fired for practicing truth telling in this situation, you're probably in a very toxic environment that the best thing you could do is get somewhere else. And, there was many times in my career, I would come home and tell my wife and say, I'm either going to get fired or promoted, but not sure which. Our brain will run away with the negative, and it doesn't necessarily understand, like, well, what are all the great things that could happen if I speak up and tell the boss what I feel about this, or if I tell my teammates how that make me feel, or if I share with the customer what I want or what I don't want. So the biggest barrier is our brains. Our brains are wired to protect us from danger. We have the flight or fight reactions, and we just need to get control of understanding that our brain might run away with us and be self-aware, manage our emotions, and then say, what's the best for the team? What's the best for the situation? What's the best thing? Okay, speaking up is the most likely thing to happen, and that would be beneficial. And I'm going to go into a second reason. The second reason it's really difficult, the second big barrier to practicing truth telling is that if we haven't practiced it in the past, it's extremely awkward. It feels difficult. It feels harder than it is. The first few times we try it, we might fail miserably because it just doesn't come out in our voice and it seems insincere. I equate it a lot to like riding a bike, right? If you have never ridden a bike, the first couple times you ride a bike, it will feel impossible, right? And so we need to find a way. If you're not normally truth telling, how can you get into truth telling? If your team is not normally telling, how can you get your team to a mode of truth telling? And so this change management comes in. And one of the things I like is find something that's simple. One of the simplest methods you can use is say, oh, let's bring our team together. Maybe we have a weekly meeting and tell my team, okay, for the rest of this year, in our weekly meeting starting next week, I want everybody to bring a start, a stop, and a continue. Come with a list of like, what's one thing you want us to start? What's one thing you want us to stop? And one thing you want to continue. And this might be awkward and unusual at first, in the first few weeks, maybe hard. And I like it. I love the metaphor of popcorn popping. It may take a while for it to take off. If you ever made popcorn on the stove, you put in the oil and the popcorn and you put in 2 or 3 or 4 kernels, and then nothing at all happens. And you're staring at it and it's not working and nothing happens, right? And you shake it around and move the oil and the popcorn a little and nothing happens. But then one kernel pops, and then a few seconds later, another kernel pops. And then you dump in all the popcorn and you manage the heat, and then it all happened. When you're doing new things with teams, the same thing happens. You have to have a little patience, right? So build in some mechanisms. So like the weekly start, stop, continue is a great, easy mechanism. It's not that scary for people. I'm not asking you to talk about your emotions at work yet. I'm just saying, what's one thing we could start? What's one thing we should stop? What's one thing you think would be beneficial if we continue? And there's like only 1 or 2 rules you'll apply to this, only 1 or 2 boundaries. And the first one is you can't come in and say, I want us to stop doing the start, stop, continue. That's kind of out of bounds, right? You have to come in and contribute. So it's one of the ways you can easily get to a mode of truth telling.
Viewer and listener Laura has inadvertently cracked me up here. Laura says, I have my PhD in pre-thinking. So there you go. It also goes on to say something that we haven't really kind of talked about yet. Laura mentions working with people who are calm when mistakes happen makes me want to work with those people more. So, naturally, as a leader, right, having poise, having grace under pressure is probably critical. And I don't know if you have any techniques locked and loaded and ready to go for that, but maybe talk about that. Your duty as a leader to not demonstrate panic and things along those lines. Any thoughts on Laura's comment there?
I 100% agree. That's a great comment, Laura. Thanks for that. It's always a journey. In order to address that, we need to be self aware. So building our self-awareness, building our understanding of like, what emotions am I carrying into this meeting, right? So Laura had a big failure. We're going into a meeting with Laura. I could certainly be upset. I could certainly be panicked, and certainly it's going to make me look bad before my boss. But being self-aware enough to say, well, what are the matrix of goals? I want to thank Laura for telling me honest about this. I want to encourage her to share information. Like if you're in leadership, one of the key things you're trying to get is I want bad news faster,
Yeah.
right? So I don't want to build an environment where people are afraid to tell me bad news. So like it really doesn't matter how bad the news is. Somehow I'm going to try to celebrate, right? I'm going to try like, oh, thank you so much for telling me, and let's figure out a way to address this situation. And I'm going to try to engage them in that challenge. Like, what do you think we should do in this case? Or I may even use, depending on where that person is in their development, I might say something like, what would you do if I wasn't here? If I was away and unavailable, how would you handle the situation? And unless their idea is extremely dangerous, I might just say, go ahead and do that. You know, so how we react to these situations is hypercritical, right? And we can only do that if first and foremost we're aware of our emotions, and then we have the ability and skill to say, okay, I'm aware that I'm really upset, I'm really angry, I'm really frustrated that I didn't know about this a week ago. And also, my goals for this person are this. My goals for relationship are this. My goals for this team are this. And what emotion would be good for me to carry into this meeting may be very different than the default emotion I'm going to have initially.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I love the idea. Boy, I didn't think I was going to bring in a Godfather reference, but there's a moment where I think it's Robert Duvall says the Godfather insists on hearing bad news immediately, and I think that's I think we all understand why because you're able to respond and act in a deliberate, measured, kind of thoughtful way. Okay, one workplace challenge that comes up. You and I were talking about this earlier. When things may external factors may influence what's going to be happening with the team, an external factor. An example you cited would be like a vendor screwed up, right? The deliverable that we received is not what we anticipated. And then other dynamics are introduced. There's this idea of blaming, right? And I want to ask you, to what degree is blaming truth telling? And then there's a victimization kind of dynamic. Can you talk about this particular area of dysfunction potential?
Yeah. So this is actually, in my opinion, if you said like, what are the top 20 areas you can work on in your team that will dramatically improve performance? This is one of them. So in the example, like the vendor supplies you parts that are late and they're wrong, right? And so now your team's in trouble. Their delivery is going to be behind and over budget. It is a honest statement to say, this is not my fault. The vendor let me down. It's an honest statement. It's factual. It's not necessarily beneficial. It's giving up more control than you want to give up. And it's not taking control that you're going to want going forward. Because if you allow that to sit, and I would label that as playing the victim, right? If the vendor screwed up and you say, our team's behind and we're over budget because the vendor let me down. It's a true statement. It's factual. But you're also playing the victim. And I'm not going to let the vendor off the hook for their mistakes. But here's the thing. If we don't change our mindset, we're setting ourselves up for that to repeat itself over and over and over and over and over again, and we'll never get better. And so we coach and teach our team members and ourselves as well, because, we all play the victim once in a while, even I do. And we try to catch it and say, well, wait a minute, what was my role in the situation, right? I got busy and I didn't check on the vendor. I was planning to visit the vendor 2 weeks ago and I didn't bother to do it. What could I have done differently? Could I have asked the vendor to send some first article samples last week so I could have checked, is the whole dimension the right way, right? There's always things we can do. And I'm not saying we're taking responsibility for somebody else's error. We're still going to hold them accountable. We're going to still let them know how that affected us and our team and what our expectation is and what we want and what we need. However, we're also going to find a way that we're not going to act like we're the victim. We're going to find a way to have more positive control going forward. And this is incredibly empowering to teams. Nobody wants to feel helpless. Nobody wants to feel like there's no way me or my team can succeed because we can't count on our vendors, right? They want to feel like, oh, we've had some struggles in the past and it's an opportunity to improve. And here's how I'm going to make a pathway to improve that. And so more visits with the vendor, improving the relationship with the vendor, improving the communication with the vendor, those type of things, taking control of that. This is actually a critically important thing. If we can get people on teams to play the victim less, we find out that they take more chances and they dive in and have more control over the future performance of the team and things around them.
And you had suggested that the way to get yourself out of this is to increase communication, keep it real with your coworkers, and start to bring about a level of honesty and problem solving that you may have not been inclined to do so before. So, what do you think of that?
I mean, that's absolutely true. And you have to encourage people. I mean, they have to see it in action, right? And you have to sometimes walk them through it. So like, yeah, I agree that the vendor's totally messed up. And I'm going to actually personally go visit with the vendor and make sure they understand the ramifications, the seriousness of it. Now let's just put that aside for a minute and brainstorm. What can we do differently next month? We're not even beating on the failure now. We're not saying you should have done something. I hate the word should. I try to abolish the word should. But like, what would be beneficial over the next month as we deal with this vendor? What are the steps we could take that are going to reduce the likelihood of a repeat occurrence in the future? And so helping people see that if I say, hey, let's not play the victim here, I'm not attacking you and saying, oh, you're doing something wrong, but I'm recognizing a different mindset that leads us to activities that increase our control is beneficial for our company and for ourselves.
And historically, we call what I alluded to keeping it real with coworkers, being brutally honest.
Yeah.
You call this radical candor. What's that about?
So radical candor is this concept of caring extremely deeply for people and for the company and for the success of the team. And at the same time, being very direct in how we challenge things that need to be challenged. And so, like, playing the victim is a great place to say, this is a great place to practice radical candor. I would say, absolutely, Chris, you're right. The vendor screwed up. What could you have done differently? And let's be candid about the fact that you kind of got busy with other things and just trusted that this, or maybe you just hoped this was going to work out. And you didn't speak up when you started to have concerns, and you didn't hop in the car and go visit the candor. And I'm not blaming you either, but let's be honest. We need to, as a company, we need to have more control of this, or we need to ensure there's a less likelihood of this happening often in the future. How can we do that? So I think that radical candor is one way to think about being direct, being honest, and I'm doing it because I really care about the situation and the people.
There's a little bit of an emergent through line in our audience questions, and it's kind of a difficult thing because we haven't talked about this, but we talk about some of the dynamics that are in play here to some degree in the abstract, some degree practically. But a couple of people are wondering, what if there's somebody who's particularly emotionally unstable on the team? What if the narcissist? How do you deal with personalities that don't enable and perhaps are blockers to the high performing team who is telling the truth?
Directly. So also directly, and
Yeah.
also significantly caring about that person, but also caring how that's affecting the team. We will have to deal with difficult people in our lives. And one of the first things to do is to realize by labeling them a difficult person, we may have indirectly changed how we relate to them. And so if I'm dealing with a difficult person, yes, it's going to be more work. Yes, it's going to be more stress. Yes, I'm going to document more things. So if you're a difficult person to work with and we have a meeting, you're probably going to get an email afterwards that says, as we agreed to in the meeting, Chris, these are the things you committed to do by next week, right? And so I'm going to have that paper trail. I'm going to have a little bit of that CYA. But I'm also going to think, by thinking of you as a narcissist or thinking of you as undependent or thinking of you as a bully, how is that affecting how I relate to you? And I will actually conscientiously think, what's another way I can think of this person? How can I relabel this person, right? This is a person who maybe like cares deeply or, you have has anybody dealt with somebody who complains a lot, right? Complains about every little thing, right? Well, this is somebody who's really good at sharing what they're feeling. right? I could reframe that in my mind so there's something positive about it, and that will change how I relate to this person. Yes, it's going to be more work. Yes, I'm going to cover my tail a little bit with a little more documentation. Yes, I might be a little more direct. And also, I might be very clear and I might practice truth telling like, hey, when you argued about this in front of the vice president yesterday, this is how I felt. This was the ramifications. This is what I want. I'm going to practice these techniques. I'm not going to stop practicing, but I'm also going to understand that my goal is not to fix you. If you're a complainer, if you're narcissistic, if you're a caveman, I'm not going to change that. But I'm also not going to change the norms of what I deem is acceptable for my team. Right. And so I'm going to set boundaries. It's going to be a little more work. We're going to document a few more things. I'm going to make it clear to you what I expect and the ramifications if I don't get it. And only very rarely would that mean I need to remove you from my team. But sometimes it means that. But most of the time, that's not what it's going to be. And I've actually found, at least for me, when I was taking over teams and handling change management on teams that were in trouble and turning teams around, I often found it took me 1 to 2 weeks to see what people were bad at and what their weaknesses were. But for some people, it took me 3 or 4 months to see what they were great at. And give yourself time to look for the good in people and to figure out how does what they're really good at align with some sort of business or team need. And that takes more time and that takes more work. But I've had people where I took over a team and somebody said, this person is a complaining curmudgeon and nobody likes working with them, and you're probably going to need to fire them. And like everything I saw confirmed that. But after I worked for a while, I realized, hey, wait a minute, we have this huge need where the engineering team is putting out user manuals that are full of gaps or ambiguity and confusion. And if I let this person review the engineering manuals and complain about them and tell me every little thing you find wrong, I found a way like, okay, the thing that annoys you, and everybody else is annoyed by this mannerism or personality trait that you have or this behavior you have, there's actually a place for that. And you can't always find that. And it does take time. But, I'm very careful about, please, don't label people based on certain aspects of their behavior. And if you find yourself doing that, relabel them by some positive aspect of the behavior because it changes what you look for in them and what you demand of them.
And there you go. So, Robert, how can we connect what we've discussed here to real high performance? You've brought a couple tools and resources again that our audience can think about, search, and incorporate into their own high performance ambitions and objectives.
Yeah, and thanks for that. One of my favorite models for high performance team is the Drexler-Civet model. And it includes the first two steps in the model, which need to happen when somebody joins a team. It needs to happen on new teams, but they're also reoccurring steps. They have to happen over and over again. And there's an aspect of psychological safety in them, and there's an aspect of truth telling in them. And so we think of uncomfortable conversations like when there's a performance or behavioral gap, it's an uncomfortable conversation to address it. But there's other conversations that don't happen. There's other areas where you need to truth tell that we might not be comfortable doing that are critically important. And so, for instance, when somebody joins a team, there's two fundamental things that are going around in their head, unanswered questions, that if they remain unanswered, that person and consequently the team will never get to high performance. It's going to hold them back. And these questions is the orientation stage. Why am I here? What's in it for me? Am I going to love working with Chris or am I going to hate working Chris? Right? How is this going to go for me on this team? And the second one is trust. Do you have my back? Are you competent? Will you do what you say you do? How will you behave when I make a mistake? How will you behave if I ask for help? So these are the type of things that when people join a team, they're unspoken questions that if we don't, as a leader, realize I have to truth tell around these questions until these people are comfortable that they're going to love it here. There's going to be benefit for them. They know they can trust me. They know I have their back. They understand why this is going to be a great experience for them. And once you answer those, and the metaphor, the symbolism here is like a bouncing ball. It's like those little pink super balls we used to have. You need the stage 1 and 2 to bounce high enough to get to the stage 6 where performance is really good. And then we also need to understand as leaders that these questions come up over and over again. They don't just happen the first 2 weeks you're the team. It happens as things change in your life. It happens as your friend gets a raise and you don't get a raise. It happens as your team gets past a certain milestone in a project. So as leaders, part of truth telling is also speaking into questions that don't get asked and reaffirming trust and purpose for people on the team. I think a lot of times people are dealing with remote teams nowadays and hybrid teams. And Google did a great study where they looked at like what are the real barriers to high performance remote people on teams and what are the biggest obstacles if I'm working remotely, what are the real issues? And the one everybody expects, well, communication is difficult and collaboration is difficult. And that's true, but that is actually the number 4 issue. And so there's all these other issues that we as leaders need to learn to find mechanisms, a way to speak into. And so the top 3 issues were not communication. The top 3 issues were ones of, I don't feel like I belong on the team anymore, right? If we work together in the same building, there's this sense of belonging. And the sense of belonging is critical. If you maybe are like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, sense of belonging and love is there. It's like number 3. So this is like hypercritical. The other one is not only is the sense of belonging broken, but my work-life balance is a mess. For any of us who work remotely, we know like very easily the balance between home life and work life gets this blur, and that leads to stress. It leads to burnout. And so as leaders, we need to have truth telling and conversations on our team about, okay, I have a bunch of hybrid workers. How are you each managing your work-life balance? Because if they don't manage that work-life balance, they're going to be under a stress level that's not maintainable. And that affects your ability for the team to perform.
So, as someone from the College of Engineering, I think you'll appreciate this follow-up question here, which is these frameworks, these recommendations, some of the prescriptions, and some of the tools and frameworks that you've outlined here. Is there any actual evidence that any of this works?
That's a great question. And there's a lot of evidence. And one of the ones I like the most is actually the Gallup Q12 poll, because it's been going on for decades. This is an ongoing survey. I think it's something like 3 million people have now responded to this survey. It's a huge survey that's going on. And it asks only 12 simple questions, and then it measures 11 business outcomes. And the direct relationship between these simple questions that lead to, like, they're really talking into purpose, to value, to belonging, to psychological safety, to am I trusted? Do my opinions count? Can I ask questions? These type of questions directly reflect major business outcomes. And I don't have the percentages up here, but like if you read through, there's things like you can have 23% more profitability. You can have like 48% less customer dissatisfaction. I mean, they're really big numbers. They're really impactful numbers on profitability, customer retention, employee retention, and other things that matter directly to customers. So if people haven't looked into the Q12 questions and the Q12 outcomes, I strongly encourage them to do that.
This is another example. Both of these, Drexler's CBIT team performance model and the Gallup Q12. I highly encourage our audience to check these out. You Google them; the resources everywhere. This is the gold standard for working on this kind of stuff. So, Robert, any final tips for those of us in the audience who are working on teams who want to kind of kick it up and get to a high performance level?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things, and we could talk about this for a long time, but maybe just kind of sum it up. There's some simple things you can do in changing the language you use in your workplace. A lot of times we treat things as facts that aren't facts, and a lot of times we don't share the things and clarify what they are. So like using phrases like, I have a feeling. I have a feeling that, or I have a belief that, or I'm worried that, my fear is that. Using words that clarify that what you're about to talk about, it's not a fact. It's something critically important, but it's also based on your feelings, your belief, your biases, your emotions. And opening up difficult conversations with phrases like this can be highly effective at starting conversations that might otherwise be difficult. I remember, just as one last example, I once had a person who was a pretty good performer on a team. And all of a sudden I noticed, like, your performance has been lousy for the past 2 months. I didn't know what was going on. And so instead of going to them and say, your performance is not acceptable, and it kind of like hitting them with facts, I just said, I have a feeling that for some reason you're not able to engage with work as well as you used to. And they said, well, actually, I'm going through a really messy divorce. I had no clue they were going through a divorce. And, if you think about Hertzberg's theories of motivation, these factors of personal life, there's no way you can be motivated and excited and engaged at work if something like that is going on in your personal life. Now, as a supervisor, I couldn't fix that they were going through that. But it turns out the mere understanding where they were at, them knowing I understood and cared about it, them realizing that of course, I also give them the feedback. So, well, this is what I'm seeing, and I do need you to still do your job. That simple conversation led to a 180 in their performance. Their performance went back up to a very high level. There was nothing hidden between us. They knew I understood. I couldn't fix what they were going through, but they realized, okay, I have to still do my job. My job is important. People are noticing, and it made a difference. And so these are really good ways to open up difficult conversations.
Thank you for listening to Cornell Keynotes. Now, check out the episode notes if you want to learn more about Cornell's project leadership and project management 360 certificate programs. Now, I want to thank you for listening, friends, and please subscribe to stay in touch.